Welcome, I'm Hernan Murdoch. In this episode, we're going to take a closer look at active listening. You think about listening, everybody's talking, but the question is, are we paying attention to each other? Do we understand each other? So, to help us better understand dynamics around active listening and more effective communications, especially the verbal ones, Kathleen Crawford is going to help us discern some of the key things we need to keep in mind. Welcome, Kathleen.
Hello, Hernan.
So, like I just said, people keep talking quite a bit, but the question is, are we communicating? Is the
Mm.
message coming across? So, what are some of the ways that we can make sure that the intent with which we speak is understood and then receives the proper reaction to what we said?
Well, you have set me up with a perfect segue once again, Hernan. I have a graphic for us to start exploring that, and it starts with a riddle. So let's take a look at the graphic, and the riddle is this: what is the opposite of speaking? And yes, as you said, it should be listening. We're listening, we're talking, and then someone is listening to us and they're speaking and we're listening. But in our culture, well, I'm American and I come from a very boisterous family. In my family, the opposite of speaking is sometimes waiting for your turn to speak. So instead of giving people a fair hearing, it does become a bit of a free for all, and hopefully that's not happening in a professional context, but sometimes it is.
Mhm.
Sometimes because we're focused on our own agendas, what we have to get done, we may not give people as fair listening as we should be giving them. So I'd like to discuss a little bit some of the challenges of listening well, and some of it relates to the speed of speech versus how easily or how fast we can hear things. So there in English, we know that there are some statistics that have been reliably collected. We can generally speak on average between 100 and 150 words per minute. There are people who can talk faster than that, and certainly there are people who speak more slowly than that, but the range is about 100 to 150 words per minute. But according to researchers, our ears as a mechanism have the opportunity to take in much more information, and our brains can process a lot faster than that. So in English, again, the speed of listening is between 400 and 600 words per minute.
Hmm.
That means that there's a huge gap. And if any of our viewers are feeling a little bit skeptical about that, I'd like to offer up a couple of examples. If you listen to books on tape or you like to listen to podcasts, have you ever speeded up the podcast because you were so interested in the topic that you wanted to consume it faster? If you are one of those
Mhm.
people, chances are that 125 to 150 words per minute may make the speaker sound like Mickey Mouse, but you're taking in the information.
Mhm.
Also, you can think of advertisements, the disclaimers, legal disclaimers. So at the end of a great, commercial on a new model of the Lexus or something, they have a legal disclaimer. You may not catch every single word, but you're definitely getting the essence. So what the
Mhm.
advice here is to figure out for yourself, if you find your mind wandering when someone is speaking, and this is now in the context of our audit work, we're interviewing, we're meeting with people, how can we fill the gap for better results?
Mhm.
That's what we want to come
Right.
away with. Okay?
Yeah. Very important to be mindful about that and to also minimize the distraction, because the other thing that can happen too is as you're wandering, you stop listening, right?
Mm-hmm.
So during that conversation, that interview with a client, you're supposed to be listening to everything they say. But I've also advised my team members to also be mindful of what they don't say
Mm-hmm.
and what they say and how they say it. So all of these nuances are things you need to be mindful about and pay close attention to. So if your mind is wandering and you're thinking about what's the next question I am going to ask or
Mm-hmm.
something along those lines, then you may be missing out on important details. So very important to keep this in mind.
Definitely. Definitely.
Yeah. So
So,
when it comes to active listening, what are some of the principles and things that we should be paying attention to as we focus and become better listeners?
well, the principles begin with what you just said, pay attention. So, so we need to prepare ourselves for a conversation that's going to be meaningful and productive. And that part of that, it means that you do have to prepare what is your scope of questions that you would like to get answered, and think about those before you get to the actual meeting or interview. It can't be done on the fly. Even if you're what some say are a great communicator, it still is not a good idea to leave these things to chance. So
Mhm.
preparation is key. And then pay attention, and even more important, show that you're paying attention. If you can demonstrate by keeping your body language turned toward the person speaking and making sure that he or she is aware that you are paying attention, you're not fussing about with your laptop or you're not fussing about with your notes, that you're keeping connected to them visually as well as vocally. Vocally, you can use some vocal encouragers. So you're doing things to show that you're listening. Another important thing is to provide feedback in the form of follow-up questions or periodically paraphrasing what someone has said. This helps keep things moving, but also makes sure that you close topics as they move along.
Mhm.
By all means, defer judgment. We really, what we want our listening to do is to demonstrate respect for another person's point of view. And
Mhm.
it's not about whether we agree or disagree, but it's a willingness to keep the dialogue going. So that deferment of judgment is so, so important so that we can respond appropriately by asking follow-up questions or paraphrasing what someone has said and make sure we have a complete and accurate understanding of their point of view before we move on to other things. An audit interview or a meeting often involves multiple topics, so we want to make sure we close out each one before we move on to the next one.
Very good. And yes, of course, there are going to be multiple parties to this, but from our perspective, these principles are very helpful to make sure that on our side, we're doing what we need to do to make sure that we collect information, that we uh, give it enough uh, thought so that we are going to respond appropriately and not judge prematurely, in
Mm-hmm.
which case we may be unfair with the person we're talking with. So we want to make sure we do that. So, as much as we think about ourselves and what we are supposed to do, what are some of the things we can do to help the other party understand what we are saying?
Well, I say that we want to identify the feelings and intentions behind the words. So we can do some things in terms of prefacing what we're going to ask before we ask it. There are some questions that if you just drop it into the middle of the table, it can go off like a bomb. So what can we do to lead up to things that might be hard pivots and might be a little bit ungraceful. And I would also say that part of this is our listening not only with our ears but also with our eyes. We spoke about the visual, the vocal, and the verbal characteristics of communication. So let's not focus on the words themselves, but what is the intention or what is the meaning or what is the opinion behind what someone else is saying. And if we think there would be any misunderstanding, then we should probably clarify what we mean by what we say before we say it as well. We need to evaluate the quality of the answers because this is going to create some kind of testimonial evidence, and we want to make sure that it is as complete and accurate as possible. So this skill is vital, but that does not mean that we leave our skepticism outside. Our professional skepticism does need to remain intact, but we should not presume ill intent right off the bat. We should not presume that someone is hiding something or trying to misdirect us. Chances are the probing questions and the periodic summarizing is going to be very effective in making sure that you all have all the necessary information. And if it's not, then ask some follow-up questions. Who does this? Where is that stored? We can ask a variety of follow-up questions using open-ended words on the fly. It doesn't have to be something that you prepared in a document or a script of sorts. In fact, the more unscripted this is, I think the more helpful it can be in the long run.
Right. Yes. Sometimes when we think about the interviews and the conversation we have with our clients, we have also this discussion around open-ended and closed-ended questions. But as we're talking about this dynamic as well, a lot of it is going to be open-ended questions where we just have a conversation about different things. They're describing things, they're narrating dynamics, they're explaining things to us. So a big part of this is encouraging them to speak
Mm-hmm.
and to be as um, explicit if they can be in terms of explaining the dynamics around the subject we're discussing, and us paying enough attention so that we can do justice to that,
Mm-hmm.
and be able to understand it better. So it's listening with the intent of understanding, and not being judgmental before we understand the facts, and corroborating too, which is a very important part of this discussion, is making sure that what you heard is what you understood, and if necessary, that there's documentation to support that further as well. So these are very important things. So as we're on the subject of listening better and understanding more, what are some of the habits that will then help us make sure that as we go through this whole process, that we are making sure we're following best practice associated with communication, verbal communications, and that we are going to understand each other so they understand us and we understand them.
Well, as we've both said, this is a skill that is vital to our success. So it's also not something that we can perfect. We can get better and better, and I think we need to be willing to learn. Better listeners have the intention to listen well. They plan for it. They create an environment where it's more likely to happen. Setting aside any distractions, and they'll use a few different focusing techniques.
Mhm.
Listen for the main idea, for example. So instead of listening to the words and the sentences as if you're trying to capture every single word that someone says, listen for the main idea. What is the hook on which everything that this person is saying hangs everything together. So listen
Mhm.
for almost like listening comprehension. If you remember the reading comprehension tests that many of us took in college and university, or to get into college and university, this is like
Mhm.
a study in listening comprehension. In fact, I skipped over this, but I had two older female relatives, sisters of my mother, who used to say, "You have two ears and two eyes and one mouth. Use them in proportion." That's exactly what I'm advising here, is that we need to use our ears especially, so that we are getting the true meaning of what someone says. Listen to the
Mhm.
tone and what might be underneath the surface. These focusing techniques can also include those opinions hinted at that I referred to. So opinions might be hinted at but not expressed. Some of the vocal characteristics can be the things that you tune into there. And then you have to decide, do I feel a close enough connection, a solid enough connection to this person to probe at that and to determine whether or not he or she has some kind of opinion about this or some kind of concern about this.
Mhm.
And
Yeah. Yeah,
these are better
I was
techniques.
thinking, Kathleen, that the word auditor, the root of it is audio, which is to hear or to
Mm-hmm.
listen, and very important skill. And as you think about it, and you mentioned, formal education and so on. When you think about it, most people get training on verbal communication, written communications, how to write well, how to speak well, how to speak in public, and various things like that. But I don't recall too many classes on how to listen well. So this is a very important thing to also be mindful about.
Mm-hmm.
Is that in many cases this is a new skill for just about everyone. So we just have to be mindful of it, and learn how we can be better listeners. So as far as bad listeners or the worst listening techniques, what are some of the things that we need to avoid?
Well, listening for facts, like almost having a checklist to confirm what
Mhm.
you expected to hear. Often these conversations in auditing context, often these conversations are preceded by reading some kind of documentation. So we've read through
Mhm.
some procedural documentation or some policies or whatever have you, and then we listen with that document in mind. So in our heads, we might be checking off, yep, said that, yep, talked about that, yep, talked about that. And then we lose all the nuance. So that's what worse listeners will do.
Mhm.
Also, worse listeners will be distracted by environmental things. So if there's a lot of movement going on around them, say you're meeting with someone in their office and it's an open office space, if you know yourself to be somebody who is distracted by environmental things, I might suggest changing the place, change the location to minimize those those distractions. That
Distractions.
might have been a
Yes.
little bit of what is that, a verbal, there's a word for that. Anyway, jump.
But actually, on that note, I was thinking about so many of the reviews that I've done over the years where, and the practice was generally to meet with the clients at their work site or their location, their office, their cubicle. And there are many instances where or I will meet with them, and I could tell that they were not comfortable. Maybe
Mm,
the walls were not tall enough,
mhm.
maybe cubicle walls are just short, or the walls were not thick enough, and you could tell that they were not comfortable. And again, you have to determine whether or not they're uncomfortable with the question you're asking or the place where they're trying to answer the question. But in a few instances, I asked them if they would be more comfortable meeting in the conference room where we were set up, and they took the offer readily, and then they will proceed to give me a lot of detail about what was going on. So that matter around distractions can come a number of different ways. It could be a lot of noise, but it could also be that it's just not conducive for the
Yeah.
kind of meeting that you're trying to have. So be mindful about that as well. Good
Well,
point. What?
people who
Yes.
are expert in this field talk about that as situational constraints, social constraints,
Mhm.
or psychological constraints. So your point is absolutely well taken, because this could be a case where they were willing to share information, but they didn't necessarily want that to be overheard by their coworkers because it
Right.
could upset some, some cultural connection within the group.
Mhm.
So yes, absolutely. And that's why you have to be so attentive to the visual cues. If you notice somebody looking around as they're about to answer you, you can almost feel the tension, like, I want to tell him, but I'm not sure I want to tell him, because what if
Exactly.
Susie hears me? Is she going to think that I'm outing us and we're sharing information I'm not supposed to share? Yeah, these can make a big difference.
Okay. Okay. Now, you mentioned instances where someone will be listening just because or they're listening out for certain things because they already read the procedures document or something
Hmm.
along those lines. But how about jumping to conclusions? Is that also a big problem where you have a preconceived notion
Yes.
of what you think? Oh, they're not going to tell me what's really happening, or I know that's not what's happening, even before you ask the question. So you kind of anyway, can you elaborate on whether or not that is one of those characteristics as well of not the good kind of listening?
Yes, I think sometimes it's situational. So if an area processor system, say, had a lot of problems or was known to have a lot of problems in the past,
Hmm.
some auditors would feel that the errors of the past are predictive of the future or the present. So we
Hmm.
might jump to conclusions based on how things used to be as opposed to how things are now. And I also feel very strongly that we should take each person at his or her word until there's some reason not to. So let's give
Right.
people the benefit of the doubt.
Yes.
And there's a tendency not to. If we're so focused on getting the work done, we may forget to be, dare I say, kind, dare I say,
Hmm.
accommodating. Being helpful and accommodating, and even changing. If you notice something that they're not able to be as engaged, there's nothing in the rule book that says we can't change the timing or the place of this. If it's not convenient, we can change it. And if somebody doesn't have all their documentation, we shouldn't presume that they're always unprepared. So
Right.
jumping to conclusions too early comes in a lot of flavors.
Right, very important. Absolutely. We want to be fair
Yes.
to the clients that we're working with. So thank you very much because this is very helpful in understanding better how we can become better listeners and how we can also become more effective in our communication so that the intent that we carry with our communications are perceived, captured, and have the right reaction on the part of those who are listening to us. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I think this topic is fascinating.
If you like this series, subscribe to the ACI Learning YouTube channel to enjoy more audit related content.